You're live.
Welcome to Keeping the Beat, an engaging web series hosted by the Tennessee Music Education Association in partnership with the CMA Foundation. Tune in weeknights, Monday through Thursday at 7 p.m. Central Time to learn from and interact with music professionals from around the globe, representing every facet of the vast world of music. Today is Monday, April 27th. I'm Jim Ginsburg. I'm founder and president of Chicago's Cedille Records label, and tonight my talk is called Behind the Scenes at Chicago's Nonprofit Classical Record Label. I encourage you to interact by replying to this live video stream with your questions and comments, to which I will respond throughout the hour with the assistance of our moderator, who is none other than Cedille artist, as both a performer and a composer for 30 years, Patrice Michaels. That's Patrice's hand. Now, one note, while this is being streamed live, it will remain on the Keeping the Beat Facebook page for future reference, so be aware that your comments will remain part of the archive. And with that, thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. I'm going to give my talk about Cedille Records, Chicago's nonprofit label, in 4 sections. First, an overview of the origins of the company and our mission. Then there will be a section on music production, a section on marketing and promotion, and finally, because we are not-for-profit, a section on development or fundraising. Please, and we'll take questions at the end of each section, so please prepare your questions on each section as you watch and listen, and let us know about who you are, and especially if you have any musical background when you write in, please. So before I start talking on the subject, I'm going to start with a video that I think does a good job of explaining the origins of the company and as well as our mission. I started the label in 1989. At the time I was entering law school at the University of Chicago. I realized there were all these wonderful Chicago artists who I used to hear in my days as an undergraduate in concerts and live broadcasts from the WFMT studios. But when I went to look for their recordings, there were none to be found. Chicago actually had no classical recording company to showcase these artists, so I made that from day one the focus of Cedille Records. We're recording an album of music for flute, clarinet, and piano with the McGill-McHale Trio.
Chicago is...
Recording opportunities help artists in a lot of ways. Artists often say to me that these become really their calling cards, and having a reputable label putting out really high-quality productions for these artists, they get themselves noticed.
We will gladly pass on this CD, and that will greatly increase our chances of being hired.
When you do a concert, you maybe get one review, you get one audience, and then that's it over. Whereas when you've made this, it can kind of go on and generate its own momentum for years afterwards at times, and particularly with radio airplay, you can just reach a much wider audience, and that's one of the greatest things about it, I think, for us.
Our goal is to serve the artist rather than the artist serving the label. Our promotion, as much as possible, really centers on the artists, because we're not just promoting a recording, we're really promoting the artists on the recording. One thing that makes Cedille special really is that we're not pitching repertoire. The artists really come to us with their ideas. They say, here's the music I'm passionate about recording. Because when artists play music they care most about, you get the best performances.
The process of deciding the repertoire and working with Cedille, the label, on this was really exciting, because we got to come up with all our own ideas, but then also there was that really interesting collaboration and input, and Jim was always we were bouncing our ideas off him, and it was a really organic process, I think.
To have a label that's open to using new composers and having new music and
having exciting new music and really wonderful music that will become a part of the standard repertoire for this ensemble is something that is really amazing.
I think the result will be a brilliant, varied, exciting CD. Yeah, we're grateful to the label for being open to that.
I guess what I'm proudest about for Cedille is the feedback I get from the artists and composers and ensembles we work with, how valuable they say what we do is to them, to their careers, and also to their desire to document their finest work. So before I go further, I feel like I should update some of the numbers you saw in that video, which was shot about 3 years ago, and things have advanced even since then. So we're up to over 200 recordings, 180 different artists, ensembles, composers from Chicago we've represented, including more than 80 who've made their debuts, either their first recordings or their first albums as the featured soloist, for example. And we're up to more than 300 world premieres of different works. And finally, I should note we're now up to 18 Grammy nominations to go along with those 6 awards. So that gives you an idea of the company's trajectory in just the last few years. To go back to the beginning, I actually started the label in 1989. Ostensibly, I was coming to Chicago to be a law student, but I had noticed something interesting, which is that the artists who I was actually living in Chicago as an undergrad before I was planning to go to law school, and I would hear wonderful artists in concerts and in live broadcasts, as I mentioned in the video on WFMT, our wonderful radio station that does live broadcasts of local artists. And then I go to the record store, which back when we had record stores, and look for their recordings, and there was literally none to be found. And I'm actually a native New Yorker, and this was very odd to me because in New York, if you heard an artist, of course you would find their recordings in the record store. But what was happening was the labels were really all based in New York or on the West Coast, and they had no idea what was going on in the middle of the country. So other than the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, really Chicago artists were not being recorded. And I actually had a background, including I'd done a stint with None Such Records. I had reviewed recordings for the American Record Guide for a couple of years, and thought, well, somebody should do something about this. And I guess I might have the skills to do it. And I happen to know a wonderful recording engineer. You saw him in the video too. We'll be talking about him more later, Bill Malone. And so I approached Bill with the idea of making recordings of these Chicago artists who were not being recorded. And the label started with me approaching some of the artists that I knew best from my time in Chicago, artists who anybody who living in Chicago would have heard these artists regularly, but nobody outside of Chicago, and made recordings with some of them. And pretty quickly, the label developed a reputation, and artists started coming to me with their ideas. And well, first thing I did was drop out of law school. And then pretty quickly after that, we realized to sustain what just naturally evolved as the mission of the label, these wonderful Chicago artists, we were going to have to turn it not for profit. And I'll be talking about the fundraising side of this effort later in the talk. But over the years, our mission has grown and our roster of artists has grown. But one thing that's always been a tenet is that we like to work, the artists come to us with their ideas, and we do the projects that they're most excited about, and that results in the best recordings. And actually the one represented in the video, I think, is a perfect example of the kind of artists and the kind of projects that we work on. The core of that trio, the wind players, are actually brothers who grew up on Chicago's South Side. And this being the Tennessee Music Education Association, what made, I think, things work so well for them was educational institutions in Chicago, specifically the Merit School for Music and the Chicago Youth Symphony Orchestras, which they both grew up through, to the point now where the flute player you heard is the principal flute of the Seattle Symphony, and the clarinetist, that was Damari McGill, Anthony McGill, the clarinetist, is principal clarinet of the New York Philharmonic. Well, they teamed up with a pianist from Ireland, actually, called Michael McHale, and that's how they became the McGill-McHale Trio. And they pitched a really project with really fun repertoire to me, which you got to hear some of the repertoire in the background of that video, and that's not at all unusual way for a recording on Cedille to come about. And then we really act as a resource for these artists. I get to, in my role as curator and producer, I get to say, okay, here are the artists I think really need to be heard and have their music out there. And then I vet the projects they come to me with. Sometimes artists will say, well, here's a couple of things we're interested in doing, and I'll say, that one sounds really interesting. Or maybe this one would be better for you, I think, right now, and maybe a couple of years down the road, the other one would make more sense. And so there's a sort of a curatorial function there. Do we have any questions on this yet? Okay. Well, let's see. Anything else I want to talk about? Oh, then the other thing about the mission is it's really unique. So we've been doing this for 30 years, and as far as we can tell, there is no other recording label devoted specifically to the classical musicians of a specific metropolitan area. And I think one reason we're able to do this is Chicago is really in a sweet spot because we are a major musical center, but at the same time, as I noted earlier, there was no, and still other than CD, is no label really devoted to the artists, or really, there are some labels now that have started to notice artists. Often after they record with CD, other labels start to get interested, and that's great for the artists, and it's very important to me too, because we don't believe in telling artists they have to be exclusive to us. We only want them recording for CD because they want to, and so many of these artists have been, discovered by other labels, and what often happens is other labels will basically pitch projects to them, say, here's something we'd like to get a recording made of, would you do a recording? But when the artists have projects they want to pitch, they usually come to CD, and that's very gratifying to me.
Julie would like to know what some of your most gratifying projects have been.
Oh my goodness, how do you pick your favorite children, right? I think I can talk more in terms of milestones. A couple of projects that I think have been particularly significant in the growth of the label. One would be actually our first opportunity. Well, actually, no, it's our second recording with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. I'll mention briefly the first one. A composer we work with, Easley Blackwood, was actually commissioned to write his Fifth Symphony by the Chicago Symphony, and we got to record that piece, which was really terrific. But that was actually recorded, taken from live concerts that they had done, and my job was to edit, and we'll talk about this in the music production section, those performances together into a composite. Whereas the second project would involve violinist Rachel Barton-Pine. That was one we actually produced in session, and it was a really great idea. So Rachel had been wanting to she had done a few recordings for us already, but it was a time in her career where she really wanted to do a major repertory piece, and specifically the Brahms Violin Concerto. And I said, well, that's great, and I know your performance is terrific, but how are we going to generate interest in that when there's so many recordings out there, hundreds literally, of the Brahms Violin Concerto? And she had this idea of recording it with a violin concerto by Joseph Joachim, who was the violinist Brahms actually wrote his concerto for, but who was actually extremely renowned as a composer as well. And he wrote this gigantic piece. It's called the Concerto in the Hungarian Style. One critic referred to it as the holy grail of romantic violin concertos. But it is so difficult to play, not just for the soloist, but for the orchestra, that really it never gets done, because who's going to do a 45-minute plus concerto of that difficulty that's not going to bring extra people to the concert because people haven't heard of the composer? So this recording was a chance not only to feature Rachel, but also feature this great piece. And it had great offshoots. So first of all, the recording got huge reviews. It was also our first Grammy nominee, actually nominated for Bill Malone's Engineering, which I'm very proud about. But it also had a really important thing for Rachel's career, not only because now she had a major repertory recording to show to conductors and orchestra managers to hopefully get hired for additional gigs, but in order to do this, she had a patron loan her an amazing violin. It's a Guarneri del Gesù. These are prized even more than Stradivarius's. It's from 1742, and it's an instrument that Brahms actually selected for one of his own students. And the patron said, okay, you can have this violin for a few months to get to know it and then make the recording. And then, of course, I'll need it back. Well, when the patron heard just how well the recording came out, he said, I changed my mind. You can keep the violin. And Rachel's been playing that violin to this day. So that's, I think, just to pick one milestone recording, that would be a good choice.
We have a two-part question. Chelsea wants to know if you've ever considered expanding your artists outside of the Chicago area, and Abigail asks if you record only artists that are well known.
Well, the answer to the first one is no. Our mission is really, we're chartered as a not-for-profit specifically with a mission of promoting Chicago musicians. And frankly, we put out about 8 records a year, and we get about 50 proposals, legitimate proposals from Chicago artists here. We get others from people who aren't from Chicago, and we have to say, I'm sorry, that's not the focus of the label. But we're getting more. I wish I could take all the proposals that they're coming in, but given that ratio, I wouldn't see any need to expand the focus anyway. The second question was, no, actually, that's one of the beauties of the label is most of the artists, when they start recording for us, aren't very well known at all. Some of them become well known through the recordings, which is really the goal of the label. So there are exceptions. There are a couple artists we've recorded who were already established, but that's the exception, not the rule.
Here's an interesting question from Julie. It's sort of the intersection of branding and labeling. She wants to know, since classical generally means a time period in music, how do you see classical as part of the brand, but how do you also see Cedille Records as a proponent of new music?
Well, actually, again, the repertoire ideas come from our artists, but our artists represent all facets of classical music. So we've done music from the early 17th century all the way to, we work with a lot of contemporary composers. So that's one reason we have so many world premiere recordings, although some of our world premieres are actually historical recordings too, which I'm very proud of. But so we run the whole gamut, and if you look at our artist roster, you can have a Rachel Barden-Pine who actually has a dual career. She is an established concert violinist doing major repertory concertos with orchestras and recitals, but she's also one of the world's most renowned early music players, playing violin and even other violin-like instruments, period instruments as they're called. So that's one side, the early music, and it goes all the way up, like I said, to groups like Eighth Blackbird and Third Coast Percussion, which did one of these presentations a few weeks ago. So classical, for us, really, it means a very broad spectrum.
Patty wants to know if you've ever had to turn down any artists because they weren't classical enough.
Yes, we have to make that decision. We have some projects that are, I would call, somewhat crossover, where there's still a classical basis, but they cross over into other genres. And the question always becomes, where is that line? Where do you get to the point where you're really no longer talking about a classical recording? And that's a judgment call, but it's one we have to make.
Does it have to do with the type of instruments you're using, or a particular way a composition is put together? Can you define classical?
That becomes more tricky. Again, I think it's one of those things where I have to say I feel like I know it when I hear it. I should mention that for the longest time in the history of the label, basically all these decisions I made on my own. But as our mission and reach has expanded, I've actually created, just a couple of years ago, a committee of my board, and we'll be talking about the board when we get to the development section, called the Artistic Advisory Committee, which actually acts as sort of a double check, because there have been a couple of decisions I made in the past where, in retrospect, I might have thought about it a different way and maybe said yes to a project I said no to, or vice versa. And so this committee is there to kind of bounce ideas off of, and I usually come to them and say, okay, here are the projects I think we definitely have to take. Here are some proposals that came in that I just don't think are up to what our ideal is, and then here are a couple of interesting ones, and let's talk about them. So that helps me think about these very issues.
So, do you have any recordings that you've produced that actually push those boundaries between
Oh, yes.
what you consider classical music and what might be some other genre?
Absolutely. Some examples just off the top of my head would include many of Eighth Blackbird, our contemporary music sextet discs, including one of their Grammy winners called Lonely Motel Music from Slide. That one definitely pushes into other genres. There's one, a group called Fifth House Ensemble did a collaboration with a folk group based in both Israel and Berlin called Balladino, and that definitely crossed between genres. So those are certainly some examples of how we've definitely pushed that envelope.
Well, how did they do it? Was it with instruments they brought in, or did they play tunes that had already been written from other genres?
In that case, there was a lot of improvisation on that disc actually, and classical musicians often find improvisation a challenge, but it was great fun watching these two groups work together. There was another project we did with the Civitas Ensemble, which brought in a group called the Gypsy Way Ensemble from Prague, and same thing. It was sort of the cross between the gypsy music and the classical music, and I find these musical intersections, in fact we actually have an album called Intersections, really fascinating.
All right, Alexis would like to know, what is your musical background, Jim? You left law school to start this company, but how did you actually develop your passion for music?
Well, that's a great question. I think let's make that the last question of this, because that's a great segue into the music production section of this talk. I'd always been a music lover. I can take this back to where I was a very, very small child. My mother liked to say, James was a lively child, which is a nice way of saying I was hyperactive. But she noticed that when classical music played, I would just stop running around and listen in rapt attention. So my parents started taking me to concerts all over New York. There was the Little Orchestra Society at Hunter College. There was the Young People's Concerts at the New York Philharmonic that Michael Tilson Thomas actually conducted in those days. There was Light Opera of Manhattan doing Gilbert and Sullivan's. And pretty soon I was graduating to the New York City Opera and the Metropolitan Opera and loving all of it. Started collecting records by the time I was 7. Got really in just through listening. I actually taught my high school's music appreciation class my senior year. When I got to college, I was running the classical format for our campus radio station, WHBK. Got to do work for None Such Records during the summer one year and continued to do projects for them as I continued college. As I mentioned, I also started reviewing records for American Record Guide, and I should mention also I studied piano for about 13 years, although I never got particularly good at it. But it was especially, I also did some work in music PR, but it was especially in reviewing those recordings that I started to notice something, which was, there was a big difference between well-produced recording and not so well-produced recording, and often that transcended even who the artists or composers were. And so it was at that point that I thought, well, with my background, I think I could produce recordings pretty well. And again, I knew a spectacular recording engineer who you'll hear from in a moment. And so that's what got me wanting to try my hand at it, and it turned out to be fish to water. So with that, actually, that's a perfect segue into the music production section of this talk, and really our approach to recording, which involves things like at the recording session, the careful choice and placement of microphones, and everything working collaboratively with the artists. It's so important that artists sound the way they want to sound. So and I'll be talking to one in just a moment about that experience. But before I go too far, I mentioned our wonderful recording engineer, Bill Malone. And I thought I'd just play a short video with Bill talking about an example of his approach to microphones. So one moment while I switch over to video. Oops, let's go to the next one.
recording is with one of the great baritones singing today, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Hampson, doing American songs that are poems by Walt Whitman, Langston Hughes, a few others, set to music written by Chicago composers. For this recording, we are using a RCA Model 44A. It's one of the truly great, rare, highly prized microphones in the audio world today, and I'm lucky enough to have use of it for this recording. This particular one does date from 1932. It's all original. There are no reproduction parts. It's a warm-sounding microphone. It's a true figure-8 pattern, so it picks up from the front and the back equally well, but it picks up absolutely nothing from the sides to the top, which is why the film industry liked it. They could point the dead zone, the null part of the pattern, toward the cameras, which made a lot of noise in those days, and they could point the working end of it toward the actors, and it was perfect for the early sound films. There's just something special about these old microphones.
That was an example, by the way. Somebody asked if we do established artists. Thomas Hampson obviously is an established artist, and he's not a Chicago artist, but we were able to do this project with him because of his choice of Chicago composers, including some very important composers from the mid-20th century, including two African-American women composers, Margaret Bonds and Florence Price, whose music is just now, I think, coming back into vogue, but these were incredibly important figures. Florence Price was actually the first African-American woman to have a major work performed by a major orchestra. The Chicago Symphony did her Symphony in E minor in 1933, and Margaret Bonds actually played Price's piano concerto with the Chicago Symphony around that time as well. So that was a very special project for us as well. Please remember to send your questions, especially about this section, about engineering. And let us know if you have any experience on either end of the microphone, either as a performer or engineer or producer or otherwise when you write in. So as I mentioned, it's very important to us to record artists in good venues where their sound can bloom, and it can be different. Some recordings require can be done in a large studio, others in a small chamber music hall will work. Others, if you're dealing with an orchestra, you really need a really decent size hall. And then others, where it's a group, like some of these contemporary groups, you actually don't go for a performance-based sound like you would with, say, a string quartet. You may actually go to a commercial studio and put every player in a different room, and they all have headphones on, and then we'll talk about how that all gets mixed later. But I happen to have a Cedille artist right here with me, Patrice Michaels. Can I tilt this a little bit
Sure.
your way? Okay.
Hi, everybody.
So Patrice is a soprano who's been performing on the label for 30 years and also been featured as a composer more recently, and we'll get to one of those albums later on. But I'd love to hear your experience working with Cedille in terms of how the recording sessions how we go about the recording sessions, and especially if your experience has been any different from, say, with other labels.
Because I'm really fortunate that I've worked with a couple of great producers, I find that their methods are pretty much the same for classical recording, and that kind of trust that you build up after the first couple of recordings is really special. If I think back to the first recording I made for Cedille, which was my second recording in life, it was with a chamber ensemble. So my concerns were primarily with making sure that I stuck with my musical colleagues, and I began to get to know the two guys that were set up in the other room with their all their cords hanging out, running from one place to the other. And setting levels, I think, is the most interesting part of it all, because there's going to be a certain amount of time at the beginning of every session where you just have to figure out where you stand in relation to everybody else, what kind of sound they're getting in the middle of their space, what kind of feeling we're getting back, and whether it represents what we normally get in a performance space or whether we just have to deal with it and not worry about it. It can be anything. I think my least favorite space to record ever was actually one of my favorite places to broadcast, and that's the wonderful room at the WFMT studios in Chicago. We can do a lot of live broadcasting there, and it's really fun. But we did a very small forte, piano, and voice recording there that I just didn't enjoy the feeling of recording there at all, because it was too close and it was nothing like real singing to me. So I just had to go on faith that that's what it was.
I thought you didn't like that because I worked too hard.
No, it was really the feeling of the room. I remember what you're referring to is that we went back on about the third day. Usually it takes us 3 days to make a solo recording with about 3 to 4 hours of work a day. And on that last day, I remember that you asked me to do straight takes of a couple of songs that I thought we had done the first day. And so I just did it. And of course they were better because they were just off the cuff, more like performances.
Well, and I'll add to that, actually. We had worked through most of the repertoire, but we hit a point in that last session where I felt like everything that was, singer, and I should note that, singers can be a little different because their instrument is their own body. And so, a clarinet, as long as, the reed's in place, will probably sound similar from one day to another. But a singer can sound very different from one day to another. And while we had good material in some of those songs, and we worked through them in sections in fact, I'll mention in a moment how we usually work. But we got to a point in that last session where everything I thought that was coming out of Patrice's throat was pure gold. And I thought, let's just get a single take of everything we can while her voice is this perfect. And we did. Until we got to one point where it just, boom. I don't know if you remember that. It just went.
Oh, the voice always goes eventually. Yeah. It ends.
But it wasn't like, it was like, it just, everything was gold, and then it wasn't.
Sorry, buddy.
But we got awesome material from that. Actually, Thomas Hampson, though, he experienced some of the same things. He had some passages that didn't work so well in the earlier sessions. So in the last session, where for whatever reason his voice was just in better shape, I said, let's cover some of those hard passages again. And that's what we ended up using for those hard passages. So these are the kind of things that a producer has to be aware of. Typically, the way we would do a session is, if it's shorter movements, you probably play through the movement once. Usually I ask the musicians to come back and listen to themselves so they get a sense of how it's sounding. And then maybe a couple more takes, and then usually you want to break things up and really concentrate on different sections to make sure you have everything as good as possible. With really long movements, you may not have the luxury of doing a full take. You may have to break it up into larger sections and then smaller sections. But actually what Patrice said about levels is very important, because in the early days, we had to mix everything to 2 tracks right away because we didn't have the ability to do post-production in multiple tracks. So getting those balances was really crucial. Nowadays, we can edit in a lot of tracks. Some of our orchestral recordings, we're editing 32 different tracks. So there, the important thing, you don't have to worry about all the levels being perfect. What you want to make sure is you have the right fix on every instrument, or an orchestra, every section, every group of instruments. And that's where I rely so much on the musicians, because what we'll do at a session is we'll do some takes for sound, and then we'll invite the musicians back to listen, and they'll say, yeah, that's exactly like how I think I want to sound. Or they'll say, that's really not my sound. I sound too distant, or I sound too piercing, or whatever. And then we figure out, is it a question of level? Is it a question of mic placement? Is it a question of the mic itself? If you noticed in that video, Bill talked about that wonderful old RCA mic, but we had sitting right next to it a brand new Neumann microphone as a backup, just in case that in case that old thing didn't work as well as we thought it would, but of course it did. So we never used that Neumann mic at all. It just sat there. Although it sat there and recorded just for safety, but we didn't use any of that in the post-production.
It might be interesting for me to offer that, especially with this long period of time now, 30 years, as Jim mentioned. In the beginning of my recording life, I was still a little dubious that it was appropriate to go back in and have little short fixes that, producer could edit to make an idealized recording. But, it was the industry standard as soon as it was possible. And what I discovered, and I think a lot of other people have discovered, is that with a great producer, you end up with an idealized version of yourself. And then you have to live up to that even more.
Well,
so it actually pushes a lot of people in a very interesting way. I'm amazed by that.
Well, I like to think of a recording as a reference, and this is what artists want. They want a reference version that they can put out there. This is our best, in that moment. But nothing is going to replace the excitement and the energy and the connection of a live performance, and we know that. But that's exactly why we want recordings to be as good as they can be, so that they have their function. A recording that just sounds like a live. And the thing about a live performance is, in the moment, it sounds great. Very often, if you take it home, you then hear all the parts that weren't so great. So we don't want those on recordings. Recordings, at least that we make, we really want to sound as exciting on the 100th listen as they sound on the first listen. So once Patrice still mentioned about that studio, we've actually moved more and more toward concert hall recording for those kinds of recordings. Although actually, because the forte piano has such a light sound, the studio actually did work for that, and I think that recording came out sounding marvelous. But musicians like to be in a space where they can hear their own instruments and their own voices breathe. So, of course, that is.
And Abigail wants to know, how do you decide which place is best for which type of group?
So, again, largely has to do with the size of the ensemble and the amount of volume that the instruments or the setup creates. So that's again, if you're going for the more performance-based recording, then there are groups that, especially contemporary groups, which are doing things that you just can't really record properly that way, where you really need a specific isolated fix on each instrument. Excuse me. So when you're done with the recording in whatever space it is, then comes and the artists are happy with their performances. Then comes what I call the magic happens. This is the editing and mixing. My job as producer is then to take all that material and make the composite, the really best, take the best bits, the best takes, and string them together in a way that they fit. Because if you have one take that's considerably faster or louder than another, it may be tricky to fit them together. But you want to take those and make the idealized composite recording. And then there's the mixing, which involves, and this is when we have multiple channel recordings now, you can adjust balances later. So if you have a place where maybe the flute wasn't quite as strong as in the session as you wanted it, you might be able to bring up the flute afterwards and especially working with conductors. In fact, I'm doing an album right now where a conductor had a lot of balance adjustments he wanted after hearing the first edit, and happily, because we had done this in so many channels, we were able to do that. So it's a combination of the editing and the mixing, and then again, I'm always getting feedback from the artists. I'm not going to put out anything until the artists are thrilled with it. And in many cases, that's kind of the basis. But with some recordings, there's even a further step where we bring in an outside mastering engineer. Again, it's our contemporary groups that tend to go for this. In fact, we just finished an album for June release with Eighth Blackbird, not one I produced. I should note that I produced the lion's share of what's on the label. Through our 64th recording, I had produced all of them, but the work of running the label full-time and producing all the recordings got to be too much, so I started farming things out to some of the best recording producers in the country, which was a great luxury to have. But I still produce the great majority. But anyway, this is one where Elaine Martone, a Grammy-winning producer, produced, and Bill Malone, our engineer. Even when I'm not producing, Bill is still usually the engineer. They had put together this recording with Eighth Blackbird, and it sounded terrific. But Eighth Blackbird said, to really put this, and they sort of have their own brand when it comes to sound. And they said, we really need another step. We need a mastering engineer who's nothing to do with the project, with fresh ears to listen to this. And I said, well, you guys have a pretty good track record. I'm not sure how he's going to improve on this, but sure, you can have your mastering engineer. Wow, when we got this back from the mastering engineer, it was on another level entirely. And he just took a fresh look at the balances and the perspectives on the. Again, this was done with a lot of isolation, so there was the possibility of still making a lot of adjustments in terms of the sound, even after everything had been put together. And it's an even greater recording as a result of that.
Julie asks an interesting question that's related to that. It must have cost extra money to do that extra mastering, and it must have been a bit of a challenge for people to really get what they wanted from you in that, because you'd never done it before.
Oh, no, we've done it.
Oh, all right. In any case, have you ever done a project that you ended up feeling like it wasn't worth the money or the time or the effort in the human relations that sometimes are considered the diva syndrome?
Well, I'm going to sidestep that last part. As in any business, you encounter all kinds of different personalities, and some are more pleasant to deal with than others, shall I say. But no, I've never. At the end of the day, I'm proud of all our recordings, and both from the perspective of the producer and as I said when I started this label, I'm only going to make recordings that I would actually want to listen to. But at the same time, what's really important to me is that these recordings serve the artists, and we'll be talking about our promotion in that respect in a moment. And the other thing I should mention is that in the mastering, there's another side to mastering, which is there are so many different formats for music these days, and so you have to make sure the music sounds good in all of them. And this is again where Bill Malone, our engineer, is so wonderful. So he will, make a record. We'll have a basis for a recording, which is usually 96 kilohertz sampling, 24-bit rate in terms of the resolution. But that then gets, what's interesting is, the CD standard was set so long ago that it's below the standard in which typically recordings are made and worked on in these days. We do all our production in the high level recording that as the original recording, but then you got to go down to 44.1 kilohertz sampling and 16-bit resolution to make a CD. Obviously, most people are hearing these things now on streaming sites where it's down to MP3 level, but you can still make an MP3 sound pretty good if you know what you're doing. But on the other hand, there are also streaming sites and where people can actually get things at the highest resolution. So we have to preserve our master in that resolution, the highest resolution for high def purposes, and like mastered for iTunes, for example, purposes, even at the same time that we then make these offshoots for CDs and MP3s and the rest.
So you're saying that your editing is not affected by the market value or the audience that is streaming or purchasing.
Yeah, the editing and the mixing, that all gets done in the highest possible format, and it's only at the very end where you literally master or remaster for the different formats.
Here are two linked questions again. Stacy wants to know, how did Jim and Bill Malone meet? And Abigail wants to know, how long does the editing process take between you guys?
Both interesting questions. Well, Bill and I actually met in college at that campus radio station I mentioned, WHBK, campus radio station of the University of Chicago. Bill was a little ahead of me in school, but we met, and it was really surprising to me because the University of Chicago doesn't have an engineering school, that somebody who is that good at engineering somehow was at the University of Chicago. And of course, Bill was not only a DJ, he ran his own classical show, just like I ran a classical show, and eventually I graduated to running the whole classical format. But Bill also did all the engineering. He and his friend, we actually had two top-notch engineers then. which is really remarkable given the type of school. So Bill also did the engineering for the station, and later went into broadcast engineering. I did a lot of stuff for WFMT. He, as a broadcast engineer, did a lot of stuff for pop radio stations, and happily, right when Clear Channel took over the station that he had been working for, we had gotten to the point at Cedille where I could afford to hire him full time as the full-time recording engineer for Cedille rather than on a per project basis. So he's been working for Cedille ever since. What was the other question?
Oh, just how did you meet and what happens when you edit together? How long does it
take?
Oh,
the editing, right. So that all depends on the recording. Some are remarkably quick. Solo keyboard typically does not take that long to edit, especially when the pianist is as wonderful as, say, Jorge Federico Osorio, whose French album I just finished working on, and that'll be out in August. Orchestral stuff actually doesn't necessarily take that long to edit. It takes longer to mix because of the balances, but usually you don't have that much to work with in terms of material because orchestras tend to be on the clock because it's usually a union deal. So you have to try to get the best material you can very quickly. Whereas a chamber music session where the musicians say, you know what, we want to take as much time as we need to get these things really perfect.
So can you give us a ratio, like if you have a 60-minute recording, how many hours you might put in?
I did at one point try to keep track of that, and then I stopped. But a chamber music recording can take a lot of hours.
What does that mean? A week? 40-hour week?
I don't know. I mean, typically I'd say each as a producer, I'm spending probably a month editing each recording. Some take less, some take more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool.
And that's editing, working with Bill on the mixes, working, and like I said, the edits go to the artists. The artists give us their comments. Back and forth it goes. All right. So, well, I think we may end up going a little over an hour. If people won't mind. Since some of those questions actually touched on marketing, I think it's time to move on to that section. And there are 4 parts to this: marketing, 5, I guess: advertising and promotion, PR, and distribution. And I'll start with PR because that's the most basic, and that's something that we've done since the beginning. We've had the same publicist, Nathan Silverman, based here in the Chicago area since the beginning. His job is to take that finished recording and get it to the music critics, the newspapers, the magazines, and the radio stations to get it as much airplay and as much critical attention as possible. And that includes writing a press release that really tells the story of each album. And one thing that works very well for us is that most of our publications, as well as on social media, for example, sponsored posts on Facebook. We also create promotional trailers. This is actually a more recent development, but we create promotional trailers for each album, and I'll be giving some examples of those in a moment. On social media, we're on all the major outlets, and we have a young lady, Maddie Rector, in the office whose full-time job for us is as a social media coordinator, and her job is to make sure we have a good presence and are telling our story on all the different social media channels. And then, of course, our website, which was actually very recently redesigned to encourage exploration. Our albums are available physically on the website as physical CDs, as well as on all major online retailers like Amazon.com, as well as retailers they're available as downloads as well on iTunes and Apple Music and the rest. And then on streaming sites in over 60 different countries, and this is thanks to a wonderful distributor. We have Naxos, which is actually the largest distributor of classical music in the world. It's wonderful to have their services. We used to actually on our website sell downloads ourselves, and we just found that got to be too much. So if you go to an album on our website, which is, by the way, cedillerecords.org, CEDILLE records.org, if you click on any album and go to its page, you get 2 choices. You have buy and stream, and buy could be buying directly from us, but you can also find out where else to buy it. But stream will take you to all the, we'll give you choices like I mentioned, like Spotify and Apple Music and the rest. But the key for us is that the promotion really centers around the artists as much as, if not even more than the albums, because we're working directly with the artists, and often they have their own PR reps as well, on the promotion of the album, because the job, again, of these albums not only is to put great music out there, but is to advance these artists' careers and legacies. And some of the artists we work with are actually particularly savvy on how to work with social media, and it's great when we get to work, in tandem with that. And every now and then, an album even gets an extra boost from like a celebrity. For example, one of Eighth Blackbird's discs, actually their last Grammy winner, one of the composers on there was Bryce Dessner, who some of you may know from the band The National. And so when he started tweeting and messaging about the album, it got a lot of attention. So, but as I mentioned, all our albums have great stories, and I thought I would use a couple of examples of our promotional trailers to show how we tell those stories. And the first one I'm going to give an example of is an album we released last year called Silenced Voices, which involved music by composers who were literally silenced during the Holocaust. But it's very important music, and it was music that this string trio, who you'll see on the video, really was able to resurrect and bring out, and it's gotten a lot of attention. So let's play that. With Cedille, I think we're going to have to
All those composers, their music and their lives were silenced. Some of them by death, some of them by being repressed by the Nazi regime.
We just felt it was really important to give these composers a voice.
Some of the pieces we're recording have never been recorded before, much less played.
There's so much hope and beauty and wonderfulness in the music.
What we are left with is very masterful, great music. It just stays with you.
So I think that gives you an example of how we're able to tell the story even through a very short video like that. Typically, for each album these days, we will put out a video like that, and sometimes we'll even put out a second video. Sometimes it's what we call our B-roll video, where it's simply titles and pictures from the recording sessions, for example, while there's also titles on the screen to explain a little bit about what the album is like. But sometimes there's a project that has a really interesting aspect that we want to tell beyond the general, here's what the album is video. And a perfect example of this actually involves my partner in this presentation, Patrice Michaels. So
Hello again.
I'm going to bring her back in. And we did a project a couple of years ago called Notorious RBG in Song. And I guess this is where I have to reveal that, because this was really a family-based project in many ways, that Patrice, in addition to being an artist on label for 30 years, as I mentioned, is also a composer, but there's also a personal connection, because about 20 years into our professional relationship, we developed a personal relationship. So we're actually, for the last 10 years, a married couple.
Not quite, but
almost 10 years.
It's pandemic,
September.
so let's say 10.
10 years September. Anyway, which means that RBG is actually Patrice's mother-in-law. And this project came about in a very organic way. Actually started with her 80th birthday. Can you
Not my 80th birthday, my mother-in-law's 80th birthday.
So you want to quickly explain how this came about?
Jim's sister, Jane, and Jim decided they wanted to give their mom a really special 80th birthday present. And they know how much she adores singing, opera in particular. And they knew they couldn't give her own whole opera. So they decided they would like to commission some songs in her honor. And they knew that it should be women composers, because RBG is such a champion for women's rights and has herself been such a trailblazer. So they identified 3 women from whom they asked a song, provided each of us with a text from RBG's own life, and Stacey Garup, Vivian Fung, and I got busy and came up with our own 3 little songs, some of which turned out not to be so little because the texts were really phenomenal. Vivian Fung's may have the most words because it's a recipe, a fake recipe actually, written by Sister Jane about a typical night in the Ginsburg household. Stacey Garup's wonderful song is written to the words of RBG's husband's last letter to RBG before he passed away. And the song that I wrote was based on a tribute made to RBG in honor of her 50th birthday, written by a secretary who had typed many of her legal briefs. So it was quite a wide variety of individuals talking about RBG and her life. And I was very fortunate to have the privilege of premiering all 3 of those works as the singer as well. So that natural family celebration got me thinking, with these 3 voices describing so much of RBG's life, I'm sure there are many other source documents that could give us a wonderful look into RBG's life, and that a song cycle could be created to show the prismatic vision of her. So I asked her permission, and she said, yes, you can go through my archives at the Library of Congress and see what you can come up with. And I puttered along and song by song found a structure that I loved, and it's a thing now.
And so the album that eventually came out, which you'll see, we'll get to one of the videos about it in a moment, is called Notorious RBG in Song, and features that cycle, The Long View, A Portrait of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in 9 songs, as well as those songs by Stacey Garup and Vivian Fung, who I should note were composers who were already established on Cedille Records. We had recorded a number of their works, especially Stacey Garup, who is a Chicago composer. Their songs are on the album too. But again, as part of our example of our storytelling, I'm going to play a video about one very specific song that we created from this album.
Abigail is, of course, Allen Ginsburg, who asks, did you have anything to do with RBG?
We have often heard Justice Ginsburg say in public that her mother was the most important influence on her. I couldn't even imagine the cycle without including Celia in some way. Her mother very sadly passed away from cancer the day before she was supposed to graduate from high school. There are no extant letters or any kind of documents from Celia. Since I knew that Ruth went to summer camp every year, I decided to write a letter as if Celia had written it to Ruth.
For those who don't know her whole life story, I think some of the songs from the earlier part of her life and career, I think, will be very illuminating. The letter that was created as though from her mother, I think, tells a lot.
Be independent. Prepare for difficulty. Stand on your own 2 feet.
I'm really pleased with how it came out. Thanks to a lot of conversations I had with relatives, we really kicked it around until it came out just right.
Abigail asks if Cedille Records had anything to do with the opera based on the life of RBG and Justice Scalia, called Scalia Ginsburg.
Not directly, but one aria from that opera is actually on the album. So thanks for asking that. But anyway, that's an example of telling a deeper story from the album, and we have many albums where we've done that. So are, and again, it's such an interesting aspect because not only does this feature Patrice as performer and composer, but as noted in that case, she also had to create a very special text from scratch that she, of course, ran past RBG for approval. Any other questions on
Julie
marketing?
wants to
Yes.
know, what projects are you both looking forward to in the near future?
Well, you should probably explain how this, and that's another thing I love about our albums is they often lead to bigger things. And this album was very well received. It was actually our best-selling album the year it came out as a physical CD. And since then, Patrice has turned this into actually a live show. Do you want to talk about that for a moment?
Well, Notorious RBG in Song is a 75-minute show. My favorite version of it has 4 singers that portray the different characters. We have a wonderful time telling the story of Ruth Bader Ginsburg through classical song in a jazz sort of style. So I think that's a good example of something we talked about, or you talked about earlier in the session. What is classical music, and how do you know what it is and what fits? So a lot of people are pushing that boundary all the time, and I think this project is certainly it's kind of a way to get your classical music without really thinking about it, because it's very contemporary in some ways and very, very story driven.
And I'll answer briefly the other question by talking about the album one of the albums I'm currently working on as a producer. It's unfortunately the only one that the COVID crisis has forced us to postpone everything else. One of the things we've been very good about is working ahead, so I have so much in the can, so much we've already recorded that I can work on, that all my productions that I'm personally the producer for through August are already done in terms of the music. I've been actually reviewing other producers' works on their albums that are coming out in September and November. The album we were supposed to come out with in between those two, the second half of the recording sessions were supposed to happen in March, and that actually involved a 50-piece orchestra. And of course, when things got shut down, we've had to postpone that session. But that said, the material we've already recorded involves us. We are so keen on helping artists with their careers, but we also sometimes help with the legacies of past Chicago artists. There's a wonderful composer named Leo Sowerby. Everybody knows that this is the 250th birthday for Beethoven this year. It's also the 125th birthday of Chicago composer Leo Sowerby, Pulitzer Prize winning composer from Chicago, born on May 1st. And this album was supposed to come out this year to celebrate the birthday, but includes 2 pieces that he wrote for the Paul Whiteman Orchestra for the same tour that George Gershwin wrote Rhapsody in Blue for. And these pieces have pretty much been lost ever since, and we're happy to bring them back to life because they really are in that same wonderful sound, that genre, speaking of jazz and classical mixing together, that Gershwin wrote Rhapsody in Blue. And I think these will be a real revelation for people when they get to hear them. But to move on, our final section is about development. That is how you raise money to do something like this, because you have to realize the classical record business has never been a profit-making business, even in the best of times. It was always sort of the prestige arm of a larger label. For example, Columbia Records used to pretend that they were balancing the classical books on the classical division by counting all the Broadway hits as classical. Classical was not actually making money. And take that and then take our specialized mission of making recordings of specialized repertoire with Chicago artists who generally aren't that well known. And also, as people know, we just came out of however many, like 15 straight years of revenues in classical in recorded music declining, and you can see why we get the lion's share of our funding is actually not through selling the recordings. That covers less than 20% of our expenses. It's mostly through fundraising for people who believe in our mission. In order to be a nonprofit, we have a board of directors. which meets 4 times a year, and also the individual directors meet in groups as committees like finance and marketing and development. As well, and of course we need things like bylaws and articles of incorporation, like any good company, whether for-profit or not-for-profit, have to have. And then we reach out for funding to foundations, government agencies, individuals especially. There is some grant writing involved, of course, but really the lion's share of our funding is coming from individuals who believe in our mission, and lining up. And the key is to line up donors with what they're interested in, and that's called cultivation. And it's a very time-intensive, very personal process. We actually have a full-time development director, Julie Plansky, who does that. And it came to a point, we got one funding boost just when we became not-for-profit, because we were able to sort of hit some low-hanging fruits and people we knew right away would be interested. But got to the point where we had to really step up our fundraising operation about 10 years ago, and we actually had a company do what's called a capacity study. And what they came back to us was, people, when they hear about what you're doing and how you're helping these artists and how you're helping boost their careers, they love it. Problem is, nobody knows about it. So that became part of our goal, was to get people more familiar with our mission, and it's been very successful. And especially in more recent years, we've been able to get people interested in very specific projects. And so when you're able to line up a donor with a project they're excited about, our project-based fundraising has grown really tremendously in the last few years. But to give you an idea of how we pitch ourselves as a not-for-profit, I'm going to play another video. A lot of these videos, like the one we played at the beginning, and this one got their debut at our annual gala, which I'll talk about on the other side.
When you support Cedille, you are supporting your Chicago music community. You're supporting world premiere recordings, you're supporting the commissioning of those works, and you're supporting an organization that's led by somebody who cares so much about music and curates it in a really special and beautiful way.
What Cedille does is it really brings Chicago artists to the forefront.
When they get behind a project, they get behind it 100%. And that includes all kinds of incredible support for the artists in terms of paying for the recording and the artwork and helping to develop the concept. And none of that would be possible without the support of all the generous people who are a part of the Cedille family.
The impact that Cedille has had on our career is really large, because they chose to support us at a time that we were really at the very beginning stages of our own career. 4 of the albums have garnered Grammy Awards, which I don't think any of us ever foresaw that.
Recordings are very important for artists. You can play concerts all day long, but ultimately the recordings are what can reach the most people.
Our music does not get out there without a recording. I can't tell you how many pieces I've written that nobody knows anything about, even if I think they're my best pieces, just because I don't have a recording of it.
When we commission a new piece of music for orchestra, well, the audience get to hear it once or twice in Chicago area, but then nobody else knows about how wonderful the pieces are. It's so wonderful that we have this tremendous recording company in Chicago.
What I appreciate as an artist with Cedille is that I can present artist-led recordings, and I can really present recordings that I believe in.
With all of the recordings that we've made with Cedille, one of the most amazing things about them is that they're world premiere recordings of these pieces. And I think it's hard to actually understand the profundity of that. This is the archival recording of this world premiere piece, and that's very special.
I think Cedille is really a champion, really spearheading and really being a huge supporter for artists and for the art in general.
These albums have had such a fundamental impact on the entire arc of my life as a musician. I can't state strongly enough how important it is to have this level of support from a recording company.
So that gives you an idea of how we market ourselves as a not-for-profit, and it's so wonderful and gratifying for me to listen to those artists talk about what the recordings mean to them and their careers. The final thing I'll mention about fundraising is it also involves putting on a lot of events. These often are around album releases, major concerts that our artists are giving, sometimes subjects like planned giving. That's where you encourage people to put your company in their wills or other instruments so that they can continue supporting you even beyond. And finally, our annual gala, which for us is a huge source of our revenue. We've been doing this for about 8 years, and each year it gets bigger and bigger and becomes an even more crucial part of raising the money to do what we do and be in the quality we do. And by the way, pay the artists, because unfortunately, a lot of record labels, do not pay their artists. Sometimes there are even labels out there where the artists are paying the labels to put out their work. So that's another thing that sets Cedille apart. Before I take questions, I just want to show a quick video, show you how we market our annual soiree, and then I will take all the questions.
Cedille Records' annual benefit soiree is one of the best parties of the year, for sure. Cedille Records is a not-for-profit enterprise whose mission is to support artists through these recordings. It's really important that we remember that this is a critical piece of the puzzle when it comes to supporting the art form that we all love. You get a fabulous concert by some of America's top international artists, and then you get a delicious dinner, and you get to hear from some of the recording artists, meet them up close and personal. It's just a really fun celebration of the best of Chicago music in an atmosphere that's both relaxed and sophisticated, and it's really grown to be one of my favorite nights.
Okay, so that gives you an idea of what that's like. It's a very special evening for us, and we're hoping that we'll be able to have it as usual this year. It's obviously a little hard to project what will be happening in September. It's always the Sunday after Labor Day in our case. So you said there was a question?
Yeah, we have one great question to wrap up with. Abigail would like to know, who is your personal favorite composer, and have you recorded any of that music?
Well, I have to say, I'm going to give two answers. There's a wonderful Chicago composer. So I would say my favorite composer to work with these days, living composer, Stacey Garrett, based in Chicago or in Evanston. And we've done, her music's been on 10 different albums for Cedille now, including 2 devoted exclusively to her music. But my all-time favorite composer is a Russian composer of the 20th century named Dmitri Shostakovich. And for the longest time, there was no Shostakovich on the label because no artist had come to me and said, I'd like to record something by Shostakovich. And again, I'm not pitching the ideas, they come from the artist. Well, the Pacifica Quartet, which is a group really known for doing complete cycles, that is taking a composer and playing and recording all their music. And they did, for example, for us, the complete quartets of Felix Mendelssohn. They said, we're doing Shostakovich cycles all over the world now. We'd really like to record this. And I thought, wonderful. And although I was not the producer of record for that one, Judy Sherman, another wonderful multi-Grammy winning producer, produced those albums. I did have the chance to listen to all the edits and make my comments on those because that was repertoire that was so personal to me. So it was greatly gratifying for me that we were able to do a complete Shostakovich cycle. And I'll also note we have a Shostakovich world premiere on the label, a little piece for viola and piano that was only recently discovered, and somehow Chicago violist Matthew Lippman got, through great persistence, got the rights to make the first recording of this piece. So I'm very proud of that as well.
Well, that's a wonderful way to wrap this up. If you have anything else.
Well, again, I would encourage people to check out our website, cedillerecords.org, CEDILLE records.org. And there are lots more of these fun videos on there if you want to check that out. But I would like to wrap up by reminding you to tune in weeknights, Monday through Thursday at 7 p.m. Central, to watch Keeping the Beat live, and remember to tell your friends about this program. Presenters who wish to apply to host an episode should send their applications via the email address tnmea.org. Again, I'm Jim Ginsburg, the founder and president of Chicago's classical record label, Cedille Records, presenting along with wonderful Cedille artist Patrice Michaels. Thank you so much for watching.